Hello and welcome again to Lunch and Learn. I see my brother back there. He's going to try to make me laugh. It's not going to work. Anyway, I'm glad you're here. We have a wonderful speaker today, my son, talking to you about war stories and history of Hopewell, Virginia, part 2. If you recall, last year he did part 1. So, by his biographical information, John Eliades is a graduate of Hopewell High School and Randolph-Macon College. He currently works for Waste Management as a sales representative for K-12 school districts, colleges, and universities in Virginia, Maryland, and Washington, D.C. He is an avid Hopewell supporter and deeply interested in preserving and sharing the rich history of Hopewell, Virginia. And he is solo this year because you recall, if you've been here in past years, he presented with his girlfriend, Ariana Kalos. But she has moved to Stanton and is working for the city of Stanton with their historic preservation. But hopefully she'll be back next year with something for us. So I'm going to count on that. But anyway, I present to you John Eliades.
Thank you all, and thanks, Mom, for the nice introduction. It's a pleasure to be here with you all again today. It's year 4 of doing this lecture series, and it's always a pleasure to do this research and put it all together and speak with so many different community members, and just putting it all together and sharing it with you all is the enriching experience, and glad to be here again. As my mom said, I typically have my friend Ari here with me, but she is working for the historic Stanton Foundation and wasn't able to help me out this year other than, editing some things and adding maps, which is a lot, but she graduated with a master's degree from UVA in May, so she's busy getting her career going, and nonetheless, I'm excited to be here with you all, and I present to you the War Stories and Heroes of Hopewell, Virginia, Part 2. So before I get going again, I said this last year and I want to emphasize it again. This is not a full compilation of the war stories and heroes. It's just a rather small sample size. There are hundreds and hundreds of more men and women and stories that need to be documented, and hopefully by continuing to do these, we'll take a chunk out of those and hopefully persuade other people to do the same. So we'll start in 1622. With the Second Anglo-Powhatan War. The 1622, in March of 1622, the Indian Massacre took place in colonial settlements up and down the James River, from Jamestown to Henricus, up to Richmond, including City Point. They were surprise attacked. 327 Virginia settlers were killed, which is actually just over a quarter of Virginia's early settlers. As I mentioned, this attack spurred the second of 3 in Anglo-Powhatan Wars, this one spanning for about 10 years. Here to the left is a rather graphic depiction of the massacre. Of course, it's just an illustration, but it represents how catastrophic it was. Nonetheless, their relationship had been good, it had been bad, and as time went along, it got worse, and basically the natives decided that they think that an attack of this scale would convince the settlers to pack up and head back to England. And for a couple years, it worked. The settlers at City Point fled to Shirley Hundred, and settlers at other smaller settlements fled to other larger settlements to be in larger groups to protect themselves. However, in time, they would come to realize that the settlers would dig their heels in and continue to fight, and continue to spread around the James River settlements and across Virginia. And I wanted to include this snippet from an article I found in the Hopewell News in 1994. It was a quote from our beloved longtime historian, Jimmy Blankenship. And in the quote, he said, "During the Indian Massacre of 1622, City Point was completely evacuated. All the survivors fled to Shirley Hundred, now Shirley Plantation. A census conducted in 1625 made no mention of City Point." Basically, it just shows how devastating the massacre was towards City Point in particular, as well as the settlements up and down the James River. Lastly, there's an interesting piece of information regarding the first free school in America that was in the process of being built in 1622. The Reverend Patrick Copeland was working to secure funding from England and other European countries to build the school. However, unfortunately, the attack foiled those plans and they were scrapped. There are some accounts that the school was already built, but those are fewer and far between than the majority of evidence that we see that it was planned to be built at the time. So we'll jump about 250 years forward to the Civil War, and I have the Bull Ring prison at City Point. Not sure what happened to that photograph there, but a U.S. Sanitary Commission agent, William Howell Reed, was quoted calling it a, quote, pen of filth and vermin. Here's an early photograph of the Bull Ring prison in City Point. It's pretty ugly, just a couple windows. As most of you know, from 1864 to 1865, General Grant and the Union Army was headquartered in City Point, and this prison was originally built to confine Union soldiers convicted or charged with a variety of crimes. However, as the Petersburg campaign grew more intense, they needed a place to store these Confederate prisoners, and so they found that this prison would do the job. As the war ended and came to a conclusion, the prison actually processed thousands and thousands of Confederate prisoners of war, either that had surrendered or had been captured, and it was basically used as more so of a processing facility where they would come in and go out and be shipped off to northern prisons. And it's interesting, Custis Lee, the son of Robert E. Lee, actually passed through the Bull Ring prison on their way up north. So there are a couple really neat resources that discuss how nasty and treacherous the prison was. One being E.B. Wise of the U.S. Sanitary Commission. He wrote in the Soldier's Journal in 1865, he referred to the prison as, quote, hell on earth. Another individual working for the U.S. Sanitary Commission overheard an officer who'd been a prisoner in Richmond's Libby Hill say that, quote, he would rather be confined in the Libby prison for 6 months than in the Bull Ring for 1. So it just shows you how treacherous and disgusting it must have been. I included a map, a Civil War era map of the Bull Ring prison. It was actually located within the vicinity of St. John's Episcopal Church. And then an early photograph of the prison being constructed. Moving along and staying in the years of the Civil War, we have the Surrey Light Artillery engaging in a skirmish between the Union Navy. This took place at Point of Rocks, and the Confederates were at Point of Rocks and the Union was in the Appomattox River. And it was in 1862, about 60 Confederate troops engaged in a firing match with the gunboats at Point of Rocks. The Federal gunboats were coming downriver, coming inland, past Hopewell, right down towards Petersburg, and these Confederate soldiers heard them coming and prepared for an engagement. The interesting part about it is I found this story in an old book written by Benjamin Washington Jones, called Under the Stars and Bars, A History of the Surrey Light Artillery, Recollections of a Private Soldier in the War Between the States. It's very interesting. He served in the Surrey Light Artillery and had quite a bit of information about it, and I was lucky enough that the Randolph-Macon Library had a copy. It's a very old book, and so I was able to really take a lot of information from that and include it in this article. It was evening when the firing started out. The ships were coming downriver and taking shots. Benjamin Washington Jones says, "Soon another shell followed, the first, and then several more to the right, and then the left of the river, as if the enemy were feeling their way and trying to locate or uncover any hostile force." So as they approached, they readied for battle, and they began to fire their weapons at the boats. And it was a very close position, about 50 yards from each other. But lucky enough for the Southern Army, they had the advantage of being on the bluff with the large boulders blocking its path, and so a lot of the shots flew over the rock and didn't damage their position. Whereas the Confederates on top of the bluff were able to shoot down on the boats, and they actually were lucky enough that they hit one of the boats and sunk it. They finally hit one of the boats and sunk it in the river, but rather than allowing it to sink in the channel, they steered it towards Gilliam's Bar in the Appomattox River and took out all their possessions and burned it. So I'm sure there are definitely some remnants of it still in that sand over there, but very interesting that there's probably a burned ship somewhere down there on the Appomattox, along with other vessels, I'm sure. Unfortunately, one Confederate soldier lost his life from wounds in the exchange, and I learned that I think 50 Union soldiers were killed during the brief encounter. It was only 2 hours, but just an incredibly high number and very tragic. But in that book, the author also mentions the Petersburg Express, a local newspaper at the time, that it contains a glowing account of the affair. A little bit of detail about the ship. I think this is probably the craziest part about the story is it was a sidewheel steamer named the Island Belle, and the author recounted that the captain was actually suspended from duty for, quote, drunkenness while ascending the river. So you wonder if maybe they were just firing those shots for the hell of it, or if they were actually trying to get the enemy out of their position. But the last thing I'll note is this engagement pushed the Union Army back, or the Union Navy back, and prevented them from getting to Petersburg, where it was said that they were going to burn the railroad bridge. And this is pretty early on in the war, and it could have been that if they were successful in getting to Petersburg, that it could have sped up the war or had a large impact on the Civil War in our area. So the last thing I'll note about Point of Rocks is a 1906 postcard. This is the City Point National Cemetery in Bee Village in Hopewell. And you'll note this really pretty stone gate that surrounds the entire cemetery. I was researching this engagement at Point of Rocks and found the Virginia Department of Historic Resources nomination form for nominating Point of Rocks to the National Register of Historic Places. And the form actually stated that, quote, tradition holds that rock from the bluffs at Point of Rocks was later sold by the Strachan family to construct a wall around City Point National Cemetery, now in Hopewell. That cemetery was established in July of 1866 and received burials recovered from the cemetery at Point of Rocks, as well as others at City Point and Harrison's Landing in Charles City County. So I thought that was an interesting tidbit I needed to include. There's a map of Point of Rocks, and it's actually not the first time I've heard this, but it was cool to see such a reliable resource claiming that this is something that they believe is local legend, at least, and there's probably a lot of truth in it. So it's cool to see it on their website and on that such an important form. So jumping forward about another 50 to 60 years, we'll start in World War I, and with a World War I era non-war hero. I wanted to include this. I felt compelled to include it because I think the story is fascinating, and the hero is an 11-year-old boy, which is pretty incredible. But as many of you know, 1915 downtown Hopewell, there's dozens of languages, ethnicities, races, religions being spoken. It's a mushroom town. There's 40,000 new jobs at the DuPont factory. It's crazy. And on December 9th, 1915, fire erupted in a boarding house on West Appomattox Street in Hopewell. The soldiers from the Virginia Guardsmen were sent down to Hopewell by the governor, I believe Henry Stewart at the time, to protect the ruins and keep law and order in place as things were a bit crazy. But they were sent down here and mainly protected the ruins from looters. But the hero of the day was a 11-year-old boy named Adam Drum. And his actions were covered in newspapers all across the country. They were covered in Maine and Montana, all the way out down south to Louisiana. And they highlighted his story and his heroism. He basically ran into 2 burning buildings and ran out with 2 babies, one baby on each time. His family had relocated to Hopewell from Richmond for employment at the DuPont powder plant, and they were residing in Bee Village at the time. I'll go back up to his photograph in just a second. I want to read a bit of the information from the Houston Post. This is a day later. It wrote that, quote, Adam Drum, an 11-year-old Richmond boy, was the hero of the fire. He dashed into 2 burning buildings and rescued infants, and finally was borne away on the shoulders of men. Drum first dashed into the building where the fire started after he heard the screams of a baby. He rushed into a front room on the 2nd floor. He appeared at the front window a second later with the infant in his arms. He shouted to the men below to hold a blanket. They grabbed a bed covering from among those thrown from the building, and the boy leaned forward and, with a cry, fell with the infant in his arms. Both were caught in the blanket and were uninjured. When helped to his feet, Drum rushed into a building next door and brought out a second infant from the 1st floor. Bystanders, astounded at the boy's daring, carried him down the street on their shoulders. Just an incredible story of bravery and courage from an 11-year-old boy. And here's a headshot of the hero of Hopewell. This was actually posted in the Richmond Times-Dispatch Richmond News Leader just a week after the incident. As I mentioned, a week later, that photo preceded the headline claiming that Carnegie Medal wanted for Hopewell fire hero. The Carnegie Medal is basically a medal for civilians who risk death or serious physical injury to an extraordinary degree while saving or attempting to save the lives of others. In my research, I found that it was true that he was nominated, although I never found any solid evidence that he was awarded. Jeannie might be able to help with that, but I never found he was awarded, and it looks like he wasn't, according to the #1 historian in Hopewell back there. But 110 years later, I think it's important that we still recognize such a brave little kid, and I really felt compelled to include it in this presentation. So, I don't know how many people know this. Sometimes the information I think a lot of people don't know, it's pretty well known, but the Lusitania and Hopewell have a pretty interesting connection. In 1915, of course, the RMS Lusitania was sunk by a German U-boat, and the sinking of that boat was a major contributing factor for the United States' entry into World War I, because it helped gain much needed public support in America for the war. The interesting thing about the Lusitania attack is it took just 18 minutes for the ship to sink, and it baffled a lot of historians at the time. And of course, as governments always do, they hide information during wartime to, keep their narrative about how things are and what's going on. And so that's exactly what they did here. They kept information about the reasons for its incredibly fast sinking, because if the public knew why it sunk so fast, maybe people wouldn't be as supportive of our entry into the war. And that's exactly what happened. The ship was carrying thousands and thousands of pounds of munitions and weapons that they were shipping overseas for the war effort, while we claimed to be an isolationist nation. Prior to this, the German army actually posted advertisements in the Washington Post, I believe, telling Americans, don't ride on these passenger carrying ships over to England. It's a war zone. And it was fair warning basically they gave, and they sunk the ship, unfortunately. And the reason for its incredibly fast sinking is believed to be that one of the torpedoes hit the munitions that were being stored and caused a second explosion, thus leading to the ship sinking at an incredibly fast speed. Anyway, Hopewell's connection is the fact that DuPont was the largest gun cotton manufacturing facility in the world at the time, and it's believed that they sent a lot of the munitions, if not all of them, to the Lusitania and to other ships that were traveling overseas to carry these weapons. It's believed that they were involved in that, and that's Hopewell's connection to the Lusitania, is that all of it was manufactured in Hopewell that led to the incredibly fast sinking. There are a couple different sources that discuss this, and there's no super duper hard evidence that I've seen, but it's all pretty much like it probably came from the Hopewell plant. So again, as I spoke about the point of rocks, the rocks that make up the City Point National Cemetery's wall, this was also, I've talked to a lot of old Hopewell residents that recall this story and do claim that it is true in fact. Here's a map that Ari helped me out creating the other night. It shows Hopewell all the way to the location where the Lusitania was sunk, almost 4,000 miles from the shores of the James River. Continuing with World War I, this is a story about a local soldier who served. His name is Private Henry Thompson, and he served with the Harlem Hellfighters. They were the famed 369th Infantry Regiment, whose motto was, "Don't tread on me, goddamn, let's go." So pretty incredible motto, but he served with the 369th 93rd Infantry Division. They were a famous all-African-American fighting division that was attached to the French Army during World War I. They were celebrated for their courage and bravery and are claimed to be the most famous regiment to fight during World War I. In addition to the Harlem Hellfighters, they were nicknamed the Black Rattlers and the Men of Bronze. They were given the Men of Bronze name by the French after they observed the courage of them fighting in the trenches. Here to the right is a picture of quite a few of the Harlem Hellfighters. And they suffered a lot in World War I. They served 191 days in combat, the most time on the front lines by any American unit, and they suffered the most casualties of any regiment. They also were not allowed to serve with the white soldiers during World War I, as the United States government wouldn't allow that. The United States government and the United States military. That's why they were allowed to be attached to the French Fourth Army, and they served alongside them for almost a year in combat. Arthur Little, he was a battalion commander for the regiment. He said that the unit, quote, "never lost a foot of ground or had a man taken prisoner. On 2 occasions, men were captured but were recovered." 170 individual soldiers were awarded the Croix de Guerre, or the War Cross, by the French government, and the entire unit was awarded that same medal as a whole. Other individuals were awarded different citations and awards, but there's one story of a young man who was awarded a Medal of Honor 100 years later for his actions by President Obama for his heroic actions. And I'll let you, I'm sure some people already know, I think there's a movie out about it, but it's pretty neat story. Unfortunately, Private Henry Thompson lost his life on the second day of the Meuse-Argonne offensive. Began on September 27th, or began on the 26th of September, and he was killed on September 27th. The Meuse-Argonne was the last offensive that led to the signing of the armistice ending the war. Sadly, there are no known pictures of Private Thompson. It's very difficult to find pictures of World War I veterans and much less information about them, but I did find a couple of things in the newspaper archives and Ancestry.com that have his wife and his name listed as listing their address as Shacktown Avenue in Hopewell in 1915. So pretty interesting street name, but he was just 28 years old when he lost his life, and he rests in the Saint-Mihiel American Cemetery in France. Right here, I have a photograph of his tombstone in the Saint-Mihiel American Cemetery. And here are a couple of different photographs. One of the unit on the battlefield, and then a couple of the unit on a ship. Look pretty happy. War must be over. So moving into World War II, I'll start with Norwood Wilson Jr. He was a graduate of Hopewell High School, the class of 1941. After his graduation, he went to Hampton City for a year, and then to VMI, where he volunteered in the enlisted Reserve Corps, and in the fall of 1944 was assigned to the 103rd Division and sent overseas to serve with the 7th Army. In 1945, Private First Class Wilson was awarded the Silver Star for gallantry in action in France. The telegram that awarded Mr. Wilson this medal, this Silver Star, was actually, the family actually has a copy of it, and it's actually the wording is all copied in the Hopewell News Archive. So I was lucky enough to have word for word explanation about what he did from the office of the commanding general. Quote, in the dawn of 29 November 1944, in the vicinity of Haworth, France, Private Wilson, on duty with Company 1, was pinned to the ground by intense enemy fire, by intense enemy artillery, machine gun, and small arms fire. Keenly recognizing a withdrawal was inevitable, Private Wilson, with utter disregard for his life, quickly organized a group of men to protect the withdrawal of troops to a protective position. Courageously, he stood his ground amid a hail of enemy fire, and not until he was assured that the last man had reached safety would he submit to withdraw. As a result of Private Wilson's magnificent courage and outstanding bravery, the withdrawal was successfully completed and many lives were saved. Here to the top left is a wartime headshot of Private First Class Wilson. He witnessed a lot of combat. He was a bazooka man and also operated flamethrowers. And in 1944, a year prior to his awarding of the Silver Star, 5 fellow soldiers that were serving in his infantry platoon wrote the Hopewell News to give praise to their Hopewell son, Norwood Wilson. And in the letter, they all signed it, and they included this. Quote, I have been in combat with him for some time, and I can truthfully say that he is a very good soldier. Our platoon has been pinned down by machine gun fire many times, and never has Wilson failed to show his ability to lead. Our platoon is very proud to have him in our platoon, and you can expect him to progress in rank as soon as it is possible. It just goes to show that prior to his awarding of the Silver Star, he was doing the same thing, being pinned down by enemy gunfire and working with his entire unit to get everybody out before they had to completely evacuate. So it just shows his bravery in battle throughout his entire service overseas. He survived the war and returned home to Hopewell, becoming active in local politics and business ventures. And the Silver Star he was given was donated to the Virginia Military Institute, his alma mater, and it's currently displayed in their facilities. His family, I think we have his son and granddaughter here with us today are in the audience, so it's nice to have a couple of the war heroes here with us today.
Hey.
Here's a really great photograph. This is the last tidbit about Private First Class Wilson, but it's a really cool photograph. I'm going to give you the story and then let you go back to see it. But in December of 2000, a fellow soldier who served with Mr. Wilson during World War II in the A&P platoon sent him a letter trying to reconnect, and he shared this an old picture. And it shows the platoon, the entire or part of the platoon, posing for a picture in Dieblingen, Germany in 1944. And I'll share with you a couple sentences from the letter. Quote, I'm sending along an old photo of us in Dieblingen, Germany, December 1944. I think this was Christmas Eve or Christmas Day. Would like to wish you and your family a Merry Christmas and would like to hear from you. Sadly, Mr. Wilson passed away in 1955 and never saw this letter, but lucky enough, it was sent to an address where his son was able to pick it up, and to this day they do preserve this photograph and feel very lucky to have it online now so people can see it and read this story. I'll go back to this picture here. This is the A&P platoon in Dieblingen, Germany, December of 1944. And of course, Mr. Wilson's pinpointed. And you'll note the child in the window peeking out behind the curtain. Last year, a week or so before our last lecture on war stories and heroes, I began to realize I've never looked in the archives trying to find anything about Hopewell nurses that served. So I became interested in that and decided that I'll do it. I wrote down a note and decided I'll look into it for the next lecture. And damn if I didn't find a couple dozen Hopewell women that served during World War II in a multitude of positions: flight nurses, field nurses, hospital nurses. They all volunteered to serve amongst their fellow servicemen, and all witnessed the horrors of war along with the fellow servicemen. In 1945, the American Red Cross conducted a survey to try to figure out how many Hopewell girls were serving in the Army Nurse Corps. The following quote was pulled out of this article that discussed it. Quote, "Hopewell has a total of 8 registered nurses in the Army Nurse Corps as lieutenants. It was revealed in a check by the local American Red Cross chapter recently. A number of Hopewell girls are in the Cadet Nurse Corps." Well, a week later, after posting that, they had to print a follow-up story saying that they missed 2 other nurses in their count. Quote, "Since publication of the names of Hopewell girls in the Army Nurse Corps, it has been found that the list was far from complete." And they concluded, "Are there any more?" Well, there were a lot more that weren't documented in those original articles. Over 10, in between 10 and 20 more, at least, that I'm aware of at this point. I have a list going. But thankfully, without the Appomattox Regional Library or the Hopewell News Archives, much of this history would be lost. You know, it's very difficult to access paper copies of a newspaper, but since they've been digitized, I mean, the stories and the records of service that we can pull from there are invaluable. And so I thank them, all the folks at the library, for what they've done to preserve that history. I figured it was appropriate to include a couple World War II propaganda posters to try to convince women to serve, so I thought that would be a great time to add those in.
Thank you.
The first nurse is Lieutenant Norma Garfinkel. She served in the Army Nurse Corps. She was a Hopewell High School graduate, class of 1938. And according to another article in the Hopewell News, she was ranked number 3 in her graduating class. She attended Sinai Hospital School of Nursing in Baltimore, and in 1944 she joined the Army Nurse Corps, serving in the 154th General Hospital. Here is a wartime headshot and brief article about Lieutenant Garfinkel, claiming that she is serving with the 154th General Hospital somewhere in England. She was overseas for several months and returned home uninjured and carried on a regular life. I also wanted to include her senior yearbook photo from the class of 1938. It shows just how involved she was in the high school. The next Army nurse I found was Lieutenant Virginia Brown. She was a second lieutenant who graduated from Carter G. Woodson High School in 1938. It was the segregated high school for black Hopewell students during that time. And unfortunately, I wasn't able to find a ton of information about her service. At the time, the Hopewell News really didn't cover black residents' information well during those years. Unfortunately, making it pretty difficult to find much evidence of her contributions during and after the war. However, I was lucky enough to find this image of her in the Old City Point and Hopewell, the first 370 years book. It's a really clear wartime photograph. I was also able to find a few snippings proving her graduation from Carter G. Woodson High School in 1938, and a brief update that was saying that told the city that she was home visiting her parents on furlough from the Army, and her parents lived in Arlington Heights. Here are those two snips. I believe there were only 7 graduates this year from Carter G. Woodson. The last Army nurse, actually rather not Army, but Air Force nurse, is probably one of the most interesting ones I've found, and that's Lieutenant Gertrude Burlings. She joined the Army Nurse Corps in February 1943 and served as a flight nurse with the 9th Air Force and the 53rd Troop Carrier Wing during World War II. She was sent overseas in February of 1944 and returned home in November of 1945. She was one of the first flight nurses. Well, her carrier wing were some of the first flight nurses to land on improvised airstrips at Normandy following the invasion. And she made hundreds of flights transporting these wounded soldiers out of France during the weeks following the invasion. And luckily enough, she wrote a letter to the Hopewell News in 1945 talking exactly about what she was doing, and I've included that here below. To the left again, another photograph. Looks like she's on a bike this time, but she is the daughter of Gus Burlings of 110 William Street. She was also one of the only nurses that I've found so far that was awarded the Bronze Oak Leaf Cluster for exceptionally meritorious service in the evacuation of wounded soldiers from the continent during World War II. That in addition to her aid medal for exceptionally meritorious service. So in this letter, she wrote to her sister, who was a director of nurses in Pennsylvania at a Pennsylvania hospital. She shared about her work aiding these wounded soldiers on flights from France and other European countries. Quote, "Nothing in the world could ever pay for the look of gratitude that is on their faces when we land for wounded soldiers. I made so many trips across the English Channel that finally I lost count. We used to take off early in the morning and fly all day. Many a time we did not return to our home base until that night. I admit that many times I was exhausted, but I didn't mind it because the main thing was to get those boys who were wounded to a place where they could get the best of care." It was really an honor to bring those boys back, and it was something to see how their faces would light up no matter how bad off they were when they were placed on the plane, because they knew they were being taken away to a safe place. We did this type of work for several months after D-Day, and then my squadron was transferred. These boys that come back really deserve the best of everything, and I feel honored that I'm able to do my part in helping them get medical care and reach safety. Gertrude Burlings, April 1945. Another war hero we have is John A. Johnston. He was a paratrooper or a parachutist that landed 20 miles behind enemy lines in the wee hours of the morning leading up to the invasion of Normandy. He was dropped, and I'll get to that letter actually. I want to tell it all together. But he was actually awarded the Silver Star during World War II. Here's a headshot of John Johnston. He was awarded the Silver Star along with a couple of other medals that I'll mention. He was a member of the 82nd Airborne Division, and this division consisted of all the men that were dropped behind enemy lines prior to the invasion. His story was published. He was wounded during the war, and his story was published in several Virginia newspapers in Hopewell and Stanton and Waynesboro, all throughout the state. He had a very interesting story. I'm just able to include a couple different paragraphs, but I'll start with, quote, 12 hours after I landed 20 miles inland in Normandy on June 6th, I found that my 4 years in the Army, 4 years of hard work and training hadn't been wasted. Each man had a job to do, and I used every trick I knew to keep alive to accomplish my mission during those first few hours. The men who didn't learn these tricks won't come home, because the Germans weren't fooling. None of my instructors ever told me a German with a bayonet would be waiting for me when I descended on Normandy. I still can't understand how his rifle fire missed me as I came in. I thought I was a dead duck when he lunged at me with his bayonet. Several seconds later, after I got him with my jump knife, I began to be afraid. Suddenly, I realized what the odds had been when I came floating down out of the darkened sky. As I mentioned, he was awarded the Silver Star, not exactly for this. It's been really hard for me to find the actual telegram or note that says why he was awarded it. But I do know that he was awarded that, as well as the Bronze Star, a combat infantryman's badge, and a Purple Heart for wounds he received in combat. It was said that his parachute had 15 gunshot holes through it when he was coming out of the sky in Normandy before he was met by the German with a rifle. So my final story today is about Ray Karakoff, and he was a member of a bomb disposal squad that served in Europe during the war. And I also wanted to include the Hopewell and France connection that we don't have in World War II, but rather we have in 2024. I'll get to that briefly. Ray Karakoff served in this bomb disposal squad. They defused ordnances and bombs. He was a graduate of Hopewell High School, the class of 1933, and sent overseas in January of 1944. He also partook in the Normandy invasion. Thankfully, he wrote extensively about his experiences overseas, and little did he know that 80 years later, they would play a pretty big part in helping put together the story of not just him, but his entire bomb disposal squad. Here to the left is a heading from the Hopewell News, another article, another letter that he wrote back home, and that was shared with the newspaper. I was laying in bed and I received a phone call from Ari telling me, have you seen your email? I was like, no. And well, soon enough I looked and found that a man from France, a French historian, had reached out to the both of us via email inquiring about Ray Karakoff. He found our contact information from our lecture last year, and because it's posted to a website, and he found our contact information, reached out, and turns out he's conducting research about the bomb disposal squad that Ray Karakoff was a part of. He's doing this to recognize one or two of the men who were killed during the war, and doing this sort of work is very dangerous. But sorry for the team's update. So there were only seven or eight people in this squad, and he was one of them. And he reached out, and he's planning on doing a panel that's going to be placed beside a plaque that recognizes the young man who lost his life. And luckily, we've been able to source a lot of good information, these letters from the archives for him, and hopefully helped him out. And we're also trying to get in touch with the Karakoff family. So hopefully we'll continue to communicate, and maybe next year have some pictures of us in France. We'll see. That concludes this presentation. I thank you all for being here. It's always fun, like I said, to present to you all. And I just wanted to note, before finalizing this presentation, I wanted to find a good quote about war, and I couldn't find anything that I felt was appropriate. But a lot of these stories, I feel like, could be interpreted as, glorifying or romanticizing war. And I just want to be clear that all of this is in no way, shape, or form do I mean to glorify this. Rather, just pay tribute and recognize and honor these young men and women that served our country, and many that, especially particularly for the ones that paid the ultimate sacrifice. Nonetheless, thank you all for being here. Does anybody have any questions? Easy enough.
I'm just curious about the little 11-year-old boy that was a hero and wrote actions he did. Do we have any information of what he happened in the adult?
So she asked, she's curious about the 11-year-old boy who we spoke about, asked if we had any more information of him as an adult. And unfortunately, I have not found anything. It took a lot to find that in the first place, and I couldn't find much. I didn't look for in the decades later, but possibly. Jeannie?
I lost track of him probably when he was about years old. His family ended up in Michigan, but I suspect he may have died young because I have never been able to find any more traces of him.
She said that she suspected that he possibly could have died young because she never found any other trace of his existence. Any other questions? Sir?
Yes, you mentioned that City Point was abandoned in the massacre, still abandoned in 1625. Do you know when it was reoccupied?
I do not. There's a good timeline. There's a good timeline out there on, I think, probably on the city's website that you could look at, but there's a good one that you can, that can answer that question. Yes, ma'am.
Do you know if there were any women from Hopewell that were involved in the 6 AAA unit that sorted out the mail, that warehouse full of mail that was all backed up?
I don't know anything about that, but I will take that note down.
I know there were some from, well, there's some people living in this area that have ancestors or, mothers that were involved in that. I didn't know if any of them were involved.
Quite possibly. I would definitely think that that's true, but I'll take a look into that. Sir?
One possible reason the Lusitania sank in 18 minutes is because, of course, it just blasted with 2 torpedoes on the star on the side. So the captain continued to raise right, not the engine, and he turned it toward the old Q sail. They were about 11 miles off the coast. And so hit the fire. So, with all that water rushing in as the ship continues to move forward, it might have had something to do with the combat.
Interesting. That makes sense. Any other questions before I wrap it up? Thank you all again.